Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today. We've got a fascinating and honestly pretty sobering topic to dig into: the systemic economic structure of British colonial rule in India. We're going to explore how an entire economy was fundamentally rewired, not for the benefit of the people actually living there, but to feed an empire.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Just think about this staggering historical contrast highlighted by historian Shashi Tharoor. Imagine an entire nation producing over 20% of the world's GDP, a massive industrialized powerhouse. Now imagine that same nation dropping to less than 3% by the time they hit independence. No way, right? How exactly does a massive economic engine experience that kind of collapse?
Well, to figure that out, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with the blueprint, trace the money through the agrarian squeeze, take a hard look at the industrial collapse, understand the devastating human toll, and finally explore the nationalist response.
All right, part one, the blueprint, decoupling and extracting. So it's absolutely crucial to understand that the colonial economy wasn't just some accidental byproduct of foreign rule. It was a machine, a very deliberate machine. And that brings us to a foundational economic concept developed by early Indian intellectuals: the drain of wealth. Now, this wasn't your run-of-the-mill trade deficit. We are talking about the systematic circulation and transfer of wealth straight from the Indian colony over to the British metropole. It essentially decoupled the Indian economy from its own people's socioeconomic needs, literally starving the domestic market just to enrich the empire. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. Scholar Dadabhai Naoroji, in his pioneering 1901 analysis, quantified this massive drain. He proved it was a calculated strategy to sustain the British economy, leaving India impoverished in its wake. It wasn't just a mistake in the ledger, it was the entire blueprint. Moving on to part two, the agrarian squeeze, fiscal maximization. To really wrap our heads around how this extraction worked day to day, we have to follow the money right into the agricultural sector. The British set up these massive, rigid land revenue systems. You had the permanent settlement in Bengal, which fixed revenues, the Riyatwari in Madras taxing individual farmers, and the Mahalwari in Punjab targeting entire villages. But no matter the name, they all shared one brutal commonality: fiscal maximization. They slapped incredibly heavy tax burdens on peasants, and get this, those taxes had to be paid regardless of what the actual crop yield was for that season. Raining or pouring, you had to pay up. Because of that rigid structure, farmers were forced into crippling, widespread rural debt just to survive. And to pay those taxes, agriculture was forcibly shifted away from everyday sustenance farming and pushed into the commercialization of export-oriented cash crops. The land was suddenly being used to serve British war initiatives and global economic gains rather than, actually feeding the local population. Which brings us to part three, industrial collapse, the fall of textiles. Now, the farms weren't the only target here. Independent, entrepreneurial profit-making was systematically stifled across the board. Just look at this stark contrast. Before British rule, India was a global textile hub with thriving artisan industries. But the post-colonial reality? Severe industrial regression. Discriminatory trade policies basically flooded the Indian market with British manufactured goods, effectively eradicating indigenous artisan skills. And what's truly devastating is just how hyper-localized this destruction could be. Take Bengal, for instance. It went from being a literal global textile powerhouse to suffering a complete economic and demographic collapse. Deindustrialization was enforced strictly to ensure British capital faced absolutely zero local competition. A real game changer, but in the worst possible way. Let's look at part four, the human toll, poverty and famine. So the crucial point is, we can't just talk about all these policies in sterile economic terms. We have to confront the devastating reality on the ground. 1943. This is the year of the catastrophic Bengal famine. It's an agonizing visual anchor for exactly what happens when exportism and food grain extraction are prioritized over human life. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen provided a really critical insight into this. He argued that famines under colonial rule were often caused by entitlement failures rather than availability crises. What does that mean? Well, it means people starved not necessarily because there was zero food growing in the country, but because colonial economic policies completely stripped them of the financial means and societal entitlement to actually access that food. As academic research highlights, these continuous famines weren't just mere natural disasters. I mean, sure, droughts happen, but the massive, staggering death tolls were precipitated and aggravated by administrative policies that explicitly put imperial profit first. It's a tough reality to swallow. Which leads us into our final chapter, Part 5, The Nationalist Response, Economic Roots of Freedom. Immense suffering inevitably fuels immense political pushback. And what's fascinating here is how shared poverty and structural inequality became the ultimate catalyst for political consciousness. Economic grievances united the masses across completely different regions and communities. Leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and Mahatma Gandhi utilized this shared exploitation as a platform to really mobilize the public. People's demands rapidly shifted from just asking for better administrative policies to outright demanding self-governance and economic justice. We see this sentiment deeply reflected by the political leaders of the time. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, for instance, noted that the fight for a separate state and self-determination was fundamentally tied to the very real danger of being denied basic human rights. Things like brotherhood, equality, and fraternity, they aren't just abstract political concepts. They are quite literally matters of economic survival when you're living under a regime designed to exploit you. These deep-seated resentments over governance, representation, and who controls the resources inevitably spilled over into complex political events. For instance, the Day of Deliverance in 1939, which was marked by the Muslim League to celebrate the end of Congress rule in several provinces, a rule they felt was hostile to their culture and security. This specific event really illustrates just how fractured the political landscape had become, driven by an underlying desperation for fair representation and safety in a highly unequal society. And all of that brings us to the ultimate colonial legacy. Now, you'll often hear it argued that the British built modern infrastructure in South Asia. But as researchers point out, that infrastructure, the railways, the ports, the administrative frameworks, was designed almost exclusively for extraction. It bequeathed massive long-term developmental challenges, structural underdevelopment, and pervasive inequalities that these post-colonial nations simply had to inherit. So that leaves us with this final, thought-provoking question. How do the lasting legacies of these colonial economic structures continue to shape the socioeconomic landscape of South Asia today? It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just stuck in the past. Its economic blueprint is something millions of people are still navigating right this very second. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.